Hi everyone, welcome back to Brookdale Farm. Well, the time's come to do a little bit more maintenance on our trailer and change out these old lights that we've got on here. This one particularly gets a bad connection in it, and depending on how many bumps you go over, you sometimes have tail lights and sometimes you don't have tail lights. And I pulled it apart and cleaned it up, and anyway, it's time to just put a new light on. So we're going to put these LED lights on instead, and I thought today I would just show you a couple of different ways of connecting the wiring on these. So I'm going to get the old ones off, mount the new ones up, and we'll come back and talk about the wiring in a minute. Okay, so we've got our new lights mounted up, and they fit pretty well in where the old ones were. We've got number plate light, which the holes lined up, which was nice, and the new lights on either side. Next, we need to start wiring them up. Unfortunately, I didn't realise I'd hit the button for time lapse on the camera, but here we are just stripping and preparing the wires ready for joining everything together. Okay, so now that we've got all our wires prepared, our tail light, our number plate light, our main lights and our power wires coming from the front, there are a lot of different ways that we can connect these, including twisting them together and wrapping them in tape. That does work to a point, but that then tends to fail. So on this side, we're going to use some crimp connectors like this, but we're also going to use some heat shrink tubing. This stuff's great. It does exactly what it says it does. When you heat it, it shrinks. So you put this over your wires. This is a plasticky type stuff. It's an insulating material. You put this over the joints, you heat it up with a hot air gun or a blowtorch or something, and it shrinks down tight on the wire. This stuff's a little bit big. You can get it in all sorts of different sizes, but I can't find the smaller stuff I've got, but this will work. These come in packets. You can get all sorts of different crimp-on fittings. You can get, this is a straight joiner, or you can get spades or ring terminals or whatever you want. They come in 3 different colours. Blue is the middle size, red is for the small wires, blue, it says here, for wires that are 4mm, and yellow is for the big wires. Now you can crimp these with a pair of pliers, or your Leatherman knife's got a crimper on it, or you can use side cutter pliers to do it. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. If you don't, but I would strongly recommend, if you're going to do many of them, go and get yourself some decent quality crimping pliers. You can get cheap crimping pliers and they work too to a certain extent, but these ones give you a really nice crimp that is less likely to come apart. Okay, so we're going to start by putting one of these crimp terminals on our red wire here. So we put a little bit of a twist in the wire and we slide our terminal on. Now we want the wire to be short enough that it goes right into the terminal and the insulation goes into this little flared bit at the beginning of the terminal. Then we put our pliers on, and we want to just crimp this end of it at the moment. That gives a nice strong crimp that isn't going to come off. We're going to slide one of these bits of heat shrink over it. And we're going to put our red wire from our light into the other end of it. Now, how do we know what all of these wires do and what to connect? The back of the packet has the wiring code for the lights down here. Now, the one that is different is the yellow indicator. Yellow is, I think, normally the right indicator, and green is normally the left indicator, but it could be the other way around. I always forget. Now, these wires are quite small and they don't fit in the crimp that well, so we fold it over to give it a bit more surface area to crimp onto. Oops. This is where it gets a little bit fiddly, holding everything while we crimp it, and then we can slide the heat shrink back up and right over the joint, and we'll come back and heat that and shrink it all later. Now, we need to remember while we're going through this process that we need to join our tail light in too. So that is the brown wire. So we're just going to twist those two wires together and give our brown wire on the other side a bit of a twist. I'll just trim that a little bit shorter. Do the same with that. Crimp it on. These pliers have got 3 different notches in them too for crimping, with the different colours on for the different sized crimps. Put the next piece of heat shrink on. Now, the more of these that you get together, the harder it is to hold everything in the right spot while you're doing it. And slide the heat shrink up. I'm just going to work through and do the other couple of joints on here, and we'll come back and shrink the heat shrink on. Okay, so we've crimped all of these up, we've got the heat shrink on. Now we're just going to use the hot air gun to shrink the heat shrink on it. You can use a blowtorch, you can use a cigarette lighter, you just need some heat on this. Now, if we come in a bit closer, you can see how the heat shrink has shrunk right down around the wires, and this just helps to waterproof this whole connection and stop it pulling apart. Now, these crimp-on fittings are great. They're particularly good if you're out doing some emergency repairs or something like that, when you're out travelling, and always good to keep a few of these in your toolbox. They can pull apart, particularly if you don't have a decent set of crimping pliers. They can work themselves loose and give you more problems later on. Also, they can, if you don't put the heat shrink on, they can get moisture in and get corrosion in there and not conduct electricity quite as well. We're also just going to use some electrical tape on this to wrap around everything. This just helps to protect everything a little bit more, and stops the individual wires from getting pulled on too much as you're bouncing down the rough roads. So this side is all finished. Okay, on this side we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're actually going to solder these wires together. Now, people say that you shouldn't ever solder wires because when you soak the wire in solder, you get a point where it changes from the solid piece of solder back to the multi-strand wire. And at that point you get a fair bit of leverage and it can break, particularly if you're going over bumpy roads and things like that. However, this trailer was built in 1985 and the wires that were going into the lights on here were soldered, and I've driven this over an awful lot of bumpy roads and they still hadn't broken. So whilst it is possible, it does weaken your wire, all of that stuff, soldering is still a reasonable option. So what we're going to do is we're going to twist the two wires together. Now we've put a piece of heat shrink on here already. You want to keep that well back or it can start shrinking while you're soldering, which is quite inconvenient. Okay, so we're going to heat the wire with the soldering iron. We're going to put a little dab of solder onto the tip of the soldering iron, and we're just going to heat the wire. We want the wire hot enough to melt the solder. And that way we know that we have got good connection. The wire is a bit like a sponge. It's soaked the solder right through it, and we're not going to end up with a dry joint. Once it's cooled, we're going to just pull the heat shrink over it and we'll come back and shrink that on. I'm going to solder all of the rest of these up and we'll come back and do the next bit. Okay, so we've got all of our wires soldered together. We've got our heat shrink over the joint. I've got this other piece of heat shrink that I'm just going to pull round and up to here to protect these bare wires, or these only single insulated wires anyway. So now we just need to shrink all of these down. And once again, we're just going to put some tape over that to finish things off. So, trailer lights are always a bit of a nuisance. Everything on this side is working. Nothing on this side is working at all. So on this side we had no earth wire actually connecting to the old light. And I said we were going to connect one anyway. And these new lights don't actually earth through the body unless you connect it. When I was digging around underneath, I discovered that the earth wire had been disconnected down there where it ran back into the rest of the harness. So that's a job for tomorrow because I've got a few other things to do tonight. But hopefully that gives you some idea as to how to join up wires. It doesn't really matter whether you use crimp fittings or solder it or even twist it together with a bit of tape on it. Somebody's going to tell you that's the wrong way to do it, and you can't do it like that. Particularly the solder joints. One thing I can tell you is that the most likely thing that is going to fail is actually your brand new long life LED lights are likely to fail before your solder joints break or your crimp joints come undone. Anyway, I hope some of you have found this little video useful. Thanks very much for watching, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye!